Hi everyone, my name's Morgan. Thank you so much for tuning in today for the Mentor of the Month on SegaNet. I am a research scientist at the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California. And today I'm going to be telling you a little bit about the work that we're doing here at JPL to explore icy worlds. But before doing that, I wanted to talk a little bit about mentoring. So mentoring has been a very important part of my life, starting from when I was, as you can see here, pretty young. This was from a science fair that I did when I was 13 years old, back in '95. And I didn't do this alone. I actually reached out and found a mentor by the name of Ken Edgett, who at the time was a professor at the University of Arizona. Now he works for Malin Space Science Systems, and he has actually built and operates the MAHLI, the Mars Hand Lens Imager, which is one of the most important cameras on the Curiosity rover that's on Mars. So being able to get in touch with him and have him help guide me during my science project, which was about life on Mars, really got me interested in planetary science, and just having someone who was, you know, this really famous scientist be willing to come and help me. And he actually sent me a very large box of basalt, which is a volcanic rock that's present on Earth and is also present on Mars. And so this is the stuff that I use to test whether or not life could grow in Mars conditions. And so having that connection at an early age, we're actually still in touch today, meant a lot to me and was part of what led me to a summer internship at NASA many years later when I was in college. And after that internship, I became a graduate student at Caltech, and from there carried on to continue the work that I do now here at the Jet Propulsion Lab. So mentoring is incredibly important and has guided me to become the person I am today. But also, now that I'm in a position of being a scientist, I like to give back and be a mentor as well. These are some photos of some of the students, either undergraduate students like Taryn Esplin in the upper left or Dana Levine in the lower right. She is now a student at UC Berkeley, is about to get her Ph.D. This is us in the Atacama Desert, the driest desert in the world. But I also mentor younger students through SegaNet. I've had the pleasure of working with Manasa Ramachandran for 2 years now. She's been doing some awesome work with cryovolcanoes, and you can see an image of one of the cryovolcanoes that she's made here in the lower right. Okay, so mentoring is great. It's gotten me to where I am today, but what am I working on today? Well, a lot of the work that I'm involved in at JPL involves icy worlds. Well, what is an icy world? Well, icy worlds are typically moons around a lot of the gas giants in our outer solar system. Now, during the formation of the solar system, you have the accretion disk, the sun is forming. The heavier elements tend to stay closer in towards the sun, the star, and then the lighter elements tend to move further out, which is why we have rocky planets, Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars closer in. And then further out, we have the gas giants like Jupiter and Saturn. But around them we have many, many moons. And these moons are typically comprised of a little bit of a silica core and water ice and liquid water underneath a shell of ice. Now these are a few examples that I've shown here on the slide. Titan is a moon around Saturn that I'll be talking about a bit more today. But there are also plenty of icy moons around Jupiter as well. Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto, which you can see on the right-hand side of the slide here, all have subsurface liquid water oceans. Now, the depths of these oceans we've been using spacecraft to try to better understand not only their properties, what kind of salts are dissolved in there, could they potentially be hosts for life, the thickness of the icy shell on top, whether there is exchange between the surface of these icy moons and the ocean underneath. So we're involved in a lot of work to try to understand these icy worlds better. And what you're looking at here is a concept that JPL has put forth to maybe one day launch and land a melt probe, something that would have a heated tip that could melt through the ice and then release some type of submersible that could go around and explore the ocean underneath this ice shell. So we're working on all sorts of cool concepts like this to try to go to icy worlds and understand them better. So far, NASA has sent quite a few missions to these icy worlds. Galileo was a spacecraft that went in orbit around the Jupiter system for several years and studied Europa, Callisto, Ganymede, a lot of these icy worlds. Cassini is still presently in orbit around Saturn and has been studying Titan, Enceladus, and a lot of other very cool moons around Saturn. Dawn, as we've all heard, has already been to Vesta and is now orbiting Ceres and is starting to give us some really amazing images of this dwarf planet that is in the asteroid belt, which is also an icy world. And then we're working on a new mission called the Europa Clipper mission, which is proposed to be launched sometime around 2030, and would be another spacecraft that would go to the Jupiter system and study Europa specifically. So we're working on and already have a lot of very great data from these spacecraft. So where do I fit in? Well, my work at JPL involves sort of two main things, lab work and field work. And the lab work is important for trying to understand some of these places that we can simulate in the laboratory. One of the icy worlds I focus on is Titan, which is a moon around Saturn, and I'll be talking about that in a little bit. And then for the field work, we try to go to some places on Earth that are similar to some of these icy worlds or other places like Mars out in the rest of the solar system. And so I'm going to talk a little bit at the end about an expedition that we embarked on to Iceland. So first, let's talk about Titan. So Titan is a really, really cool moon. As I mentioned, it's in orbit around Saturn, and it's actually the second largest moon in our solar system, second only to Ganymede. But if you count its atmosphere, yes, you heard me right, it has an atmosphere, it's actually larger than Ganymede. Titan has a thick atmosphere. It's even thicker than Earth's. It's just like our atmosphere, mostly nitrogen, although they have a little bit of methane in there too. And if you peel away the atmosphere, which we can do with various wavelength regions in spectroscopy, we can see some really amazing features on the surface. So it turns out that Titan, just like Earth, has a hydrological cycle, but instead of water, it's much too cold. The cycle on Titan involves hydrocarbons, specifically methane and ethane. These form clouds in the atmosphere, they rain down, we have evidence of methane drizzle on Titan, and then it forms all these really cool features. We see channels and gullies, we see dunes that we believe are comprised of organic material that's produced in photochemistry in the atmosphere and then rains down as aerosol particles that accumulate and then rain down on the surface to form these dunes. And we might even have, for the first time, evidence of cryovolcanism on this moon. This is one of the regions where we might see stuff coming up from the subsurface. Just like all these other icy moons, Titan also has a subsurface liquid water ocean. And it's possible, if it's mixed with antifreeze things like methanol or ammonia, that it could stay liquid as it moves up into the surface and sort of spreads out as a cryovolcanic flow. So all of these things imply chemistry, imply active stuff going on the surface. So Titan is a really interesting place to study for those reasons. So, as I mentioned, Titan has lakes and seas. These are typically in the north and south pole. And this is one of our latest maps of the North Pole of Titan. You can see we have a bunch of seas, which we call mares, like Kraken Mare and Ligeia Mare. These are comprised mostly of methane with a little bit of ethane. This is an artist's concept of what it might look like if you were standing on the surface of Titan looking at one of these lakes. We're interested in understanding more about these lakes, how they form, how long they last, what kind of chemistry could happen in them. Some work from the Cassini mission, which is still in orbit around Saturn today, is we've been able to do bathymetry, which means we've been able to figure out the depths of these lakes. Here's an example of one of the lakes, Ligeia Mare. You can see at its deepest it's about 160 meters, which is pretty deep. So these are substantial bodies of liquid. We've also seen some really fascinating things that we're still trying to understand. What you're looking at here are some synthetic aperture radar images that were taken of the same spots in a lake at different periods of time and at different viewing angles. And what we see is what looks like some kind of mystery island. First it's not there, then it's there, then it goes away again, and then it comes back, but it looks different. And so we're trying to figure out what the heck this is. Some people think that maybe it's due to wave activity and we're getting kind of reflection of some of the waves from our instruments. Some people think that maybe there's some kind of foam or some bubbles that are coming up from underneath the surface, or maybe it could be chunks of some kind of funky ice that's floating. So we're still trying to figure out what this island is made of. But I just wanted to show this to illustrate that we have a lot to learn about Titan and its lakes. So the work that I do is trying to understand these lakes, the liquid phase of Titan. As I mentioned, it's mostly methane, ethane, a little bit of propane, and a few other organics that have been formed in the atmosphere and then rain down onto the surface and also get moved into the lakes, either from rain depositing it or just falling in directly. Some of those organics are things like hydrogen cyanide, acetylene, and benzene. Now, benzene is a pretty cool molecule. It's kind of dangerous for people, but it's abundant on Titan's surface. It's been found in the atmosphere by Cassini and also tentatively identified on the surface by the Huygens probe, which was attached to Cassini. It was the European Space Agency's part of the mission, and it parachuted down through the atmosphere and landed on the surface and gave us some really fascinating data. And one of the molecules that it detected is benzene. Now, why is benzene important? Well, some of the images that we've seen from Cassini, and I'm going to go back and forth between this, show lakes, which you can see as dark patches here, dark green, but you'll see there's this kind of brownish stuff, which is highlighted in yellow here, around some of the lakes. We can kind of call them bathtub rings. Some people have referred to these as evaporites, although we're not sure that that's how those are formed. But we see these things, these rings, around the lakes, and we're trying to figure out what they're made of. Well, most likely they're made of things that are not very soluble. For example, let's say that you have a cup of coffee, right? If you have hot coffee, you can dissolve a whole bunch of sugar in there, right? More than cold coffee. Well, let's say that you took hot coffee and then you cooled it down. Some of the sugar would precipitate out, right? It would crash out. Well, we think something similar is happening on Titan's lakes, that if the lake level changes, maybe due to evaporation, maybe due to other processes, that some things that were dissolved all the way to saturation in the lakes, since they're dissolved as much as possible, any change in that volume will cause some of that to precipitate out as a solid. And we think, since benzene has a pretty low solubility, that maybe this is one of the first molecules that would do that. So we're guessing that these rings, these bathtub rings around the lakes, possibly could have benzene as one of their primary constituents. So we wanted to study how solid benzene interacts with these liquid hydrocarbons at Titan surface temperatures and see if any cool chemistry could happen. So how did we do that? Well, we made what's called a cryostat. It's basically a doer within a doer, and a doer is essentially, it's the same thing that you store your coffee in, right? It keeps hot things hot. It also keeps cold things cold. So what we've done is we use liquid nitrogen, which is about 78 Kelvin, 77, 78. The surface of Titan is around 90 Kelvin. So we have this liquid nitrogen that keeps things really cold, but now we have to heat it up by about 12 degrees to get it up to Titan surface temperature. And so we use steel spheres as a sort of thermal insulating layer, and then we've got a heater and a temperature probe to make sure that we're getting the right temperatures. So then inside this very tiny, well, it's not that tiny, it's about yay big volume, we can condense methane or ethane and make a little mini Titan lake. And then once we have that, we can dissolve things in it and then study it. And one of the ways that we've studied this is with different types of microscopy. So what you're looking at here is a microscope image. You're looking at the edge of a frozen droplet of benzene. So benzene is a solid at Titan surface temperatures. So we took a droplet of benzene, it's liquid at room temperature, and then we cooled it way down till it froze. And then we added liquid ethane, so we added a Titan lake on top of it. And then we sat and we waited. And what you'll notice here is that some of these benzene crystals, you can see broke up into smaller crystals. They recrystallized. Now this is a really important thing in chemistry. This tells us that something fundamental is happening on the crystal structure level of benzene, that somehow it's restructuring itself, it's moving around. And this was something we did not expect. So we wanted to study it more. Now, one technique that you can use to understand more about the chemistry of what's going on in a system like this is using Raman Spectroscopy. It's named after Sir C.V. Raman, which you can see here. It's nice because it's a non-destructive technique. But importantly, what this tells you about is the vibrational modes of the molecules that are present there. Typically you use lasers. We use a green laser, really high power. And the information this gives you is not only what is present. You can tell like a carbon-hydrogen bond from a carbon-oxygen bond, for example. But it also tells you about the chemical environment that those molecules are in. Now this will be important later, so keep that in mind. So this is a typical Raman spectrum that we see. We have wave number, so energy on the x-axis, and then intensity on the y-axis. And each of these peaks refers to either some type of stretching or bending mode of benzene, because we have benzene in there, but we also have ethane. So some of these peaks we can assign to ethane as well. Now it's not really important which ones are which, but what I would like to point out is this region of the spectrum right here. So if we zoom in, this is a peak in red of ethane, liquid ethane. But what we found was if we sat and we waited at close to Titan surface temperatures, we saw this other peak, this shoulder, grow in. Now this is still ethane, but remember, Raman tells you about the chemical environment that molecules are in. So what this tells us is that there's some subset of the liquid ethane that is in our sample that's in a different chemical environment than the rest of the ethane. Well, what could that be? We only have ethane and benzene. Those are the only two molecules that are in here. Well, what could that be? Well, we think that it's forming some kind of co-crystal structure where the benzene is opening up and trapping some of the ethane inside. So one thing that we did was we looked at the kinetics. We looked at this changing over time. At 4 different temperatures, we watched that peak grow in and waited until the peak stopped growing. And so these are the curves that you would get. And if you plot these curves, you can get lifetimes for each of them. And it turns out that lifetime has a special relationship with 1 over temperature. And the slope of that line is equivalent to the activation energy of that reaction that's happening. So with that, you can figure out how long it would take for this reaction to reach completion. And we determined that this would take about 18 hours at 90 Kelvin. We did these at around 100 to 125 Kelvin. But this is important because on geological timescales, this is the blink of an eye. So this means that this type of structure, whatever it is, between benzene and ethane could form readily on Titan's surface. Okay, well, what does it look like? Well, like I said, we have only 2 things in this sample, right? We've got solid benzene and we have liquid ethane. Well, let's think, what kind of ways could these interact? Well, at first we thought that this type of configuration might be what our crystal structure looks like. There's some precedent for this in the literature. On the right-hand side, there's a published crystal structure of benzene with acetylene, which is very similar to ethane. It's just got a triple bond between the carbons instead of a single bond. So you only have 1 hydrogen on each carbon. Ethane has 3 hydrogens on each carbon, but we figured it's about the same size. It could still interact with the benzene rings in the same way. So this is what we thought the structure looked like. And we did some modeling using some DFT calculations to try to justify this. And we looked at whether 1, 2, or 3 of those hydrogens was interacting with the benzene, and based on our calculations, we thought that it was this structure. Until we went to a synchrotron and actually got the crystal structure ourselves. Now, a synchrotron is basically just a particle accelerator. It's a long circular tube where you can smash particles together to generate all sorts of high energy radiation when you do this at tremendous speeds. This is a great way to get gamma rays and X-rays. Now, X-ray diffraction is a great way to try to look at the structure of a crystal. It's got to be a crystal because the atoms can't be moving around a lot. basically what you do is you take your synchrotron and you smash some atoms together and you make some X-rays, and then you focus that X-ray beam at your crystal. Now, these X-rays will actually bounce off of the atoms that are in your crystal structure, and they'll give you a pattern called a diffraction pattern. Now, if you have a lot of experience with this, if you've done it right, you can figure out, based on that pattern, what the individual atoms are in your structure and how they are spaced, where they are located. And so we did this with our benzene ethane co-crystal, and this is what we found. Very, very different than what we expected. We expected sort of a sandwich, right? 2 benzenes and an ethane in between. No. Instead, we got this really cool kind of cyclic-looking structure with 6 benzenes kind of in a circle, and then ethanes forming a tube. Now, I know this is kind of hard to see, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to drape a white cloth over the benzenes. Now you should be able to see this a little better. So we end up having these structures where we have benzene with open channels in between, and that's where the ethanes go. They're like open tubes. Really crazy. We did not expect this at all. Now this is really exciting for us because not only is this a new co-crystal that we've never seen before between these 2 species, but it forms readily at Titan surface temperatures. And this may be a way to help sort of sequester away ethane. One of the biggest mysteries of Titan is where is the missing ethane? There supposedly should be a layer of ethane, just based on photochemistry in the atmosphere, breaks up methane and forms ethane, and a few other things too, that we should see a layer of ethane on the surface, several tens of meters thick, like liquid ethane, and we don't. We don't see that, and we're not really sure why. This could be part of the answer, that maybe there are physical processes that are sort of sucking the ethane and storing it away underground somewhere. So this was pretty exciting to us. So to conclude this little part of the talk, we found that benzene and ethane, 2 organic molecules on Titan's surface, form this cool co-crystal that we've never seen before. And it's kind of similar to like hydrated minerals on Earth, like clays, and that this may be an example of a surface process where you could sequester away some of this missing ethane that we don't know where it went. The other thing is that this may happen with other organic molecules as well, and we're currently exploring that in our laboratories here at JPL. So this was a really fun project, and I'm still working on it. But the other thing that I wanted to tell you about, so it doesn't look like this, it looks like this. It's cool ring structure with the benzenes. But the other thing I wanted to tell you about was some of the field work that I'm involved with, specifically with Iceland. Now, Iceland is this really amazing island, sort of a land of fire and ice. There's a lot of active geothermal and volcanic activity going on here. Iceland sits at the junction of 3 different plates, the North American plate, the Eurasian plate, and this tiny other little plate that I can't recall the name of. And so there are parts of Iceland that are disappearing, and there are parts of Iceland that are forming at the rates of, millimeters to centimeters per year, which is pretty fast. But because of all this activity, it's got a lot of fresh volcanic material, like lava and lava flows on Iceland. And so because of that, it's great as an analog for any other place in the solar system that has a lot of volcanism. For example, the moon, the Apollo astronauts trained in Iceland to try to understand more about the geology and be more experienced in collecting and handling samples on the moon. Also, Iceland is a great analog for Mars. It's dry, there aren't a lot of nutrients, you've got temperature extremes, and a lot of these lava fields are relatively young. So it's a good place to try to study Mars as well. Well, a few of us who are involved in astrobiology at a bunch of different universities decided to cobble together funding and mount an expedition to Iceland with 2 objectives. The first objective was to determine if a site looks homogeneous, if that correlates with the life that we find. Now the point of this was, let's say that you're a rover and you go to Mars and you see an area that looks to be the same, right, based on geology. It's the same color, size, mineralogy, and you go and you collect a sample over here, and then you go and collect a sample over here. Will the life, let's say you find life, would it be the same in both samples? Would you have a better shot of finding life in one place versus the other? The reason that we thought about this is because collecting samples and testing samples on a place like Mars we're really limited, right? We only have so many sample cups, we have only so much reagent, and so we have to be very selective and very careful to make sure that the samples we are collecting are the best ones that will tell us the most about that environment. So that was our first objective. And our second objective was to prove that you could do, instead of like going and collecting a sample and then taking it back to a lab and doing some assessments, weeks later, we wanted to do this in real time. So collect a sample, analyze it right away, use that information to inform your next day or your next sample collection. So it could be much faster. So much closer to what a real Mars rover is like, as opposed to a typical field expedition on Earth, where you go someplace for a couple of weeks and then you come back and you look at all the samples much later. And you think, oh man, there's something really fascinating in this sample. I wish I had collected 9 more from that area. So that was our second objective. And the other cool thing, we didn't have a rover, but we had a bigger rover. I got to drive it. It was fun. Got to ford some rivers. It was really awesome. But okay, so we went to Iceland, and we picked 3 different lava fields. We picked a relatively recent one. I don't know if you guys heard, about 5 years ago, you remember the eruption that messed up all the air traffic in Europe? Well, that was from the formation of this lava field called, I'm going to butcher the Icelandic, Fimmvörðuháls. And so this one was erupted in 2010, and we were there in 2012 and 2013. So we got some pretty good data from this. The second lava field was one on this island that's in the southern part of Iceland called Jaime, and the lava flow is called Eldfell, and it was erupted in 1973, so a little bit older. And then we also targeted a much older lava flow from the 1400s called Landmannalaugar, which is sort of closer to the highlands area, sort of in the center of Iceland. And so here are some pictures from that youngest lava field. You can see there's not really any green anywhere. Plant life hasn't had time to come in and colonize yet. But we are pretty sure, and I'll show you some evidence later, where we've found lots of bacteria present already in this site, and archaea as well. So we used sterile technique, and we collected a bunch of samples from this area. Here are some photos of that second lava site, lava flow, called Eldfell. Now you can see there's a little bit of green here. There were some areas that definitely had started to see plant life and things come back. This was actually a really fascinating history lesson on Iceland. If you look in the upper right, you can see that's the entire island. It's pretty small, only a few kilometers across, but you see that brownish area in the upper right-hand side, that's about like a third of the size of the whole island. Yeah, all of that is new. None of that existed before 1973. That lava eruption pretty much, it increased the size of the island by something like 30 or 40%. It almost shut down their harbor, which was their source of subsistence for all of the people pretty much who lived on that island. They were able to bring in these fire trucks and boats that could pump tons and tons of water, and so they just kept trying to harden the lava so it wouldn't flow and fill in the harbor, and they were able to do it, which is pretty amazing. So we collected some samples from here. And then the last place we went to, the much older lava flow, you can see it's got tons of greenery. It also had tons of tourists. It's a really famous place to go see. And so we collected a lot of samples, but just like the advantage of doing things in real time, we studied a lot of them and found out that most of our samples were contaminated with bacteria and life from people, from tourists going in and contaminating the site a little bit. And so because of that, we decided not to use any of these samples for our detailed bio studies later on. So this is our sampling protocol. We wanted to see how the biodiversity and the types and the distribution of life varied 1 meter apart, and then 10 meters apart, and then 100 meters apart, to see if those samples would be similar to each other, or if they would vary widely. And so we picked areas that looked geologically homogeneous throughout that sampling regime, and we did this for each sample site. And once we did that, we collected samples and brought them back to our field laboratory, where we looked at them with 3 different techniques. First, we looked at fluorescence microscopy. This tells you, we could do live dead stains to determine the amount of live cells there and the amount of dead cells there, but really we only did the dead stains. So it tells you just overall how many cells are there. We did an ATP luminescence assay. ATP, adenosine triphosphate, is the energy molecule for pretty much all life as we know it. So this is a way of telling us how much life is actively alive and metabolizing and producing ATP. ATP doesn't hang around long once it's generated by a cell or once a cell dies, so it's a really good indicator of how much stuff is alive currently, right now, in the regolith you're looking at. And then the last thing we did was a quantitative PCR, and this is a way of identifying the types of species that are present. We started off pretty broad, so we were just looking at, okay, are there bacteria there versus archaea versus fungi? So that was what we looked at. Iceland was the people that we met there, the collaborators we worked with were incredibly hospitable. They actually let us use their elementary/middle school to host our field lab because it's the summertime. All the students were off of school, or out of school for the summer. So it was really wonderful to be able to use this campus for our work. So the first assay that we looked at was fluorescence microscopy. So we brought in an entire fluorescence microscope and we were looking at these samples pretty much in real time as soon as we brought them back from the field. We used a couple of different stains and basically found that this is a very difficult assay to do in a field lab. We had very, very low counts, so very few cells that we could see. We're not sure if it's because the cells kept sticking to the tephra, the volcanic soil that we collected is really has lots of pockets and nooks and crannies, so it's possible that we just didn't extract them well enough, or that they just weren't there, that we were close enough to our limit of detection that we didn't see a lot. But we did learn a lot by trying out this technique. So the other thing we did remember was ATP. Now this is our energy molecule in the cell, so this is something that tells us how many things are actively metabolizing and generating stuff. This looks a little confusing. We had a labeling system, but basically the light blue peaks were from the young lava field. The gray bars are from the older lava field. And what you can see is that the older lava field does have more life that's actively producing, the ATP that's around. It's just the abundance of alive stuff is greater for some places, but not all. If you look at some of those samples, there's a bunch of variability between them, which, I guess we expected, but we were surprised to see the extent of that variation. Now, if you look at the light blue bars, we see that there aren't there's not as much actively metabolizing stuff there, which makes sense, right? This is a younger lava field. It hasn't had time to really get its microbial community established. But what we do see is that the distribution is about the same region to region, or on the 1 meter, 10 meter, 100 meter scale. So that was encouraging to us, and it kind of makes sense. Life is trying to get a foothold wherever it can. And then the last assay that we did was trying to identify what kinds of things are there. One thing that we did find is that there's bacteria pretty much everywhere in both the young and the old sites. So here the young sites are red and the older sites are that tannish color. We found only actually two places had fungi of any kind, and that was at one of the younger sites, which was interesting to us. And then what we did see, which was kind of a cool trend, is that archaea only became established in the older lava field. So it makes sense that bacteria would come in and colonize first. There are certain types of microbes that are facultative microbes that can take advantage of reduction of sulfates or reduction or oxidation of iron, things that would be exposed in a recent lava field. And then once bacteria have sort of started metabolizing those and generating some of their own waste byproducts that other bacteria or archaea can use, then the community can get more diverse. So that makes sense then that we see some of these sort of more well-established things like archaea in the older lava flow, where things have had time to kind of build up and start to become more complex. So what were our conclusions from this field expedition? Well, we determined that you can, in fact, go to a field site, collect samples, analyze them that day, and then use that to inform your next sample run, which would be the following day. So it allowed us a lot of flexibility. We learned a lot about real-time decision making to figure out what samples were best to collect, which sites we should target again, which sites we should avoid in the future, and that worked very well for us. The other thing is that obviously we discovered, especially for things like bacteria and archaea, that areas that look homogeneous from a geologist perspective are definitely not from a biologist perspective. So in terms of trying to figure out the best samples to collect, to look for life on a place like Mars, we still have a ways to go. Now, the same team that I went on this field expedition with, we're going again this summer, and this time we're planning on bringing some reflectance spectroscopy and other mineralogical techniques to try to see if there are other correlations that we didn't originally anticipate. Things like temperature gradients, mineral composition, to see if those correlate with the types and abundances of life that we find. So that's going to be our next objective. And with that, I would like to thank you. I went a little faster than I had anticipated, so we have plenty of time for questions. So I'm online, and if anyone wants to start typing in some questions, I'd be happy to hear from you. Let's see if we get any questions. One other thing I can talk a bit more about was my mentoring experience as well, while we're waiting for the questions. So, as I mentioned before, my very first mentor happened when I was pretty young. I got involved in science fairs at a very young age, which I loved. It was so neat to realize when I was pretty young that not all of science had been discovered, that there were still things out there to figure out, and that some scientists were, instead of reading the books and learning from the books, they were writing their own books because the stuff was so new and it hadn't been discovered yet. And I, out of the blue, had emailed. Well, let me go back up to that slide. I had, out of the blue, emailed Ken Edgett, who became my mentor, and just asked him. I had some questions, and I wasn't even sure if he'd write back. You know, there's one of those things like he's a very busy professor, he's a scientist, but not only did he write back, but he followed up, and we ended up having really lengthy conversations. He gave me lots of advice about how to construct my experiments, because, you know, I was still pretty new at that age. And in fact, he worked on the Mars Pathfinder mission, which launched in '97, so I actually had the opportunity to meet him because he came out to Florida, where I grew up, for the launch. I grew up right next to Kennedy Space Center. And so it was really neat to realize that if I reached out to find a mentor, that there were lots of scientists and engineers who were very willing to fill that role. And so I sort of continued seeking mentors throughout my science career, and indeed today I still have mentors here at JPL, people who are experts in systems engineering or in science or in running JPL, people who sort of help make the decisions and kind of have a much broader perspective of what's going on. And talking to those people regularly, getting advice, has been a really integral part of my development as a scientist. So I think mentoring is hugely important, and that's why I love to give back so much by being a mentor both for college students who I've worked in the lab with and students such as NASA, who are just at the beginning of discovering how cool and awesome science is. So it's something that I really enjoy. Let's see. Any questions? Anyone? I don't see any at the moment. Let's see. Okay, well, let's see. What else can I talk about? So I mentioned that we're exploring Titan, which is one of the icy moons around Saturn. What I didn't talk about is one other icy moon called Enceladus. Let's see, I think I have a picture of it in the beginning of my talk. Let me see. Yes, so this is Enceladus. It's one of the smaller moons around Saturn. You can see these blue sort of scratch marks. They look like, we call them tiger stripes, at the south pole of Enceladus. Just like a lot of these other icy moons, Enceladus has a crust of ice, and underneath that it's got a subsurface liquid water ocean. But Enceladus is unique because not only does it have this ocean, but it's giving us free samples. So at those tiger stripes down in the south polar region, because of tidal flexing, the moon is kind of doing this because it's in a gravitational tug of war with Titan and Saturn and a bunch of other moons in that area of our solar system. The cracks are sort of, we think they're doing this, and they're doing this, and so you end up spewing out some of the liquid from the ocean underneath as plumes. And this is very exciting for us because trying to understand if these places are habitable it's really important to try to collect a sample from that ocean. And this is one place in the solar system that's just given us free sample, free sample here, all you got to do is come fly through the plume and look at it. Now luckily for us, Cassini, which is a spacecraft that JPL built that's in the Saturn system right now, has a couple of instruments that they can use to look at particles like this. And it has flown through the plume of Enceladus several times so far. We've learned that the plume is mostly water. It's got some organics in it too, and some salts as well. And some very exciting news that has just come out, I believe in Nature, but I'm not sure of the exact publication, has looked at the types of silicates that are also present in these plumes. Because there are silicates, that tells us that this liquid water ocean is actively interacting with the silicate core on the inside of Enceladus. Now, why is this important? Well, on Earth, we have the same sort of interaction in our ocean floors at places called hydrothermal vents. Now, some astrobiologists and some other scientists believe that life may have started at a hydrothermal vent. You have all the ingredients you need for life. You've got water, you have chemistry, and you have energy. Things like redox gradients and temperature gradients, things that cells can use to use for energy, to metabolize and survive and grow. So these conditions, just like were present on Earth and might have led to the origin of life on Earth, are present on Enceladus. We believe they're present on places like Europa too. And so getting more samples and understanding these subsurface oceans is a huge, important part of the work that we're doing, and lots of other astrobiologists are involved in as well. So it's a very cool place, and we're hoping to go back there with even more sensitive instruments to look for these ingredients for life and maybe life itself in the future. So it's a very exciting time to be a planetary scientist. It's a very exciting time to be interested in exploring icy worlds. And I'm going to continue to wait for questions for a few more minutes, but I wanted to thank everyone again for attending and for being involved in SaganNet. I think it's a wonderful community. The outreach that they do is just awesome, and I really look forward to continuing to see this community develop and grow over the next few years. Let's see, any other questions? I don't see anything right now. I guess that means I explained everything really well. Okay, well with that, I think I'm going to sign off. If anyone has any other questions, feel free to message me through SaganNet. And I hope that you'll stay tuned for the next Mentor of the Month talk next month in May. Thank you again, and I look forward to seeing you around.